To introduce Sue Jones and Brian Yates, our discipline scholars, no science at all, who've been working in this space for a long time and have been leading a really important project to help support implementation of the TLOs. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Should I be scared?
No, it's just one of them.
Actually, it's not that long, Liz. It's in 2010 we started, wasn't it? So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and this may in fact be the last Sue and Brian show of this importance, so we are very pleased to bring this project to you. So we've been coordinating a project that has been producing good practice guides for the science threshold learning outcomes. So let's just remind ourselves of what these science threshold learning outcomes are. John this morning referred to them as a substantial framework. And they provide a framework for what a bachelor level graduate of science will know, understand and be able to do. And I would point out, for those of you new to the group, we have many copies of the Science Standards booklet available today, and we'd like you to take them away and give them to people. So importantly though, these science threshold learning outcomes represent a reference point for the design of our curricula and indeed for quality assurance. And those of you who looked at the draft higher education standard for learning outcomes coursework will have noticed at the end they talked about reference points. The reference points that we could use for developing our own course level learning outcomes. And the second of those was in fact learning outcomes statements developed for the field of study by Office for Learning and Teaching discipline communities or other disciplinary and professional bodies. So our learning outcomes fall very, very distinctly into that category. However, the learning outcomes are only the start. Again, as John made that point very strongly this morning. What we need now is to move on to the next stage of implementing these. And in order to implement these across our sector, we need to build through our network a common understanding of how student achievement can actually be evidenced. How do we know that our students actually meet those threshold learning outcomes? And importantly, how do we demonstrate that overtly to somebody else? So we need to think about how we will provide that evidence. And once we've made that leap, we can then think about how we might approach peer benchmarking in the future. So, the science threshold learning outcomes, we now have good practice guides for them. And I'd like to point out that these good practice guides are a beginning. Brian and I commissioned these using some OLT funding, for which we are very grateful, because we saw the need to provide now some practical advice and particularly some exemplars of how these threshold learning outcomes would be embedded into our programs. Because one of the things we found when we were going around doing our roadshow was that people were very keen, for example, for their students to understand science, but when we asked them, where is that in your programs, they were often at a loss. Often understanding science seems to be something that people expected students to obtain by osmosis. Now we have a much stronger driver to actually embed this effectively in our programs. Really important point, this one here. These guides, as I said, they are in an initial starting place. They are something for us to put on the table now as a group, but they're not intended to be prescriptive. They will become living documents. They are intended to provide that initial source of guidance on both the interpretation of the science TLOs, which can perhaps be thought of as Motherhood statements. We need to drill down a bit further, and we also need some guidance on their implementation. And the way we've designed them is that they should be useful to people such as yourselves, the teaching and learning leaders, the associate deans, but also for the people like Liz's Luke she was talking about this morning, our teaching academics, who want some ideas of how they can improve their own teaching. So, we have a guide for each of the TLOs. Those of you who were here last year will know that the guide for TLO 1 was actually launched last year because that was our initial foray into producing guides, and what we'd now like to present to you is all the complete set, the set of 5. And there are our wonderful authors up there, and we'll be calling upon a couple of them in a moment to say some words to you, Liz and Les. I love that, the Liz and Les show. But before we get on to that, I'm going to ask Brian to talk to you a little bit about how we went about putting together the guides.
Okay, thanks, Sue. So there should be a handout on each table, which is just a single, for each person, just a single A4 sheet, which has some of this information, on the previous slide about the authors, and also the web links for where these will become available, the actual guides themselves. Also, I've included just a couple of copies. I didn't make enough for everyone, but of some examples of the actual guides themselves. So I think I put 2 on each table, or 1 on each table somewhere. But some of these guides, so there's one floating around for TLO1, and there's one for TLO3. So that just to prove that they're actually there. They're coming. They're almost done. We just have a few little tweaking bits to go. So, as Sue said, we had this expression of interest. We were very grateful for the people who volunteered to have a go at doing this. And the way that we structured it was to think about what would be most useful as an initial departure from the TLOs themselves as a step towards the implementation. And I guess I'd like to emphasise what Sue said. I think that when you look at these, you'll realise that this is just a step, that there's obviously more to do in terms of then the embedding in our curricula, the assessment, the benchmarking, whatever else, the validation that our students are actually achieving at TLOs. But this is a first step to try to make it a bit more concrete, if you like, about what they mean and how you might go about teaching them in our courses. So without needing them to be terribly academic, we did think it was useful to have a literature review first of what the TLOs mean, different thoughts about them, and so on. Then to include some resources, which we'll see in a moment. I have some examples of those resources across a whole diversity of areas and media and things like that, of where you might go to get some ideas. Some examples of good practice, so how these TLOs are already being addressed in some disciplines and in some areas and in some forms. And then this was an interesting one because all of our authors, as they went through thinking about this, of course, came up with gaps, I guess, or ideas where we really need to be thinking more carefully about how these could be implemented, or some issues to discuss in the future. And so that provides some future directions which may well be something that other people within the ACDS network or whatever take up the challenge to actually develop further some better ideas and so on for this. And then some references, which I know sounds a bit feeble or something. No, it sounds a bit pedantic or something, but they were important just to show that this did have an evidence base to what was being developed. TLO2 was done slightly differently to the other 5 TLOs because that's TLO2 is the one that's about scientific knowledge. And rather than provide a lot of examples of how scientific knowledge is taught and demonstrated and so on, the focus here was really on the interpretation of the TLO rather than the good practice examples. And I think that's probably a more helpful approach because a lot of us focus, or a lot of the current focus perhaps is on the knowledge, the teaching of the knowledge and so on. And we felt it was good to try to provide an overarching framework for some of that work. All right, so here's an example from, I think this is from the guide for TLO1. So here are some resources that were produced, that are included in that guide. So thank you to Robin Mutual for this. So for example, there's a couple of straightforward texts out there that one can have a look at, that she's then written a description, an annotated bibliography, as it were, about what this is about. So rather than just have a whole list of resources without any guide as to whether they're useful or which are useful, she has actually gone through and annotated this, and that's true for all of the authors. They've all had a go at providing a bit of context with the resource, which I think will make it very helpful to look at this and see whether or not it's appropriate for what you want to do, or to give you some ideas yourself. So that's print resources, but we've also included some resources for academic journals, some video resources, some blogs, some websites and so on. So try to get a range of different resources, material that will be useful there. The good practice examples, I think, are probably the thing that you might turn to first, because you want to see what other people are doing. And there are some really good examples. The authors have really worked hard at getting a diverse range of examples, trying to cover different aspects of the TLOs, different disciplines, different media, like different ways of implementing them and so on. So this is just an example of what we tried to encourage the authors to do, which was to clearly set out what the topic is, where it's taught and so on, but then below here, and I haven't actually included perhaps all the important bits and so on, but to discuss how it's taught, how it's assessed, and how it addresses the TLOs. So there are, I can't remember now, maybe at least half a dozen examples in each of the guides, which I think provide a very rich starting point for understanding what might be possible for these. And then, as I mentioned, this section towards the end about the future opportunities, future directions and opportunities. So this one has come from TLO 5, and so this sets out some ideas that came from that one about what further needed to be done in terms of thinking about developing resources and examples and good practice ideas about teaching this particular TLO and so on. And so there's some stuff there which is very interesting, I think, looking forward, as I said, to stimulate further work in this area. And then, as I say, the references, but they actually do provide the evidence base for what we're doing. Okay, so just to remind you, these are the 5 ones here. So Robin Uchel did her work mainly last year, and we're grateful finally that we've got the finished product, which is sitting there on the tables and will be on a website very soon. Sue Jones wrote the one for Scientific Knowledge, TLO 2. Les and Liz did TLO 3. Kay Colthorpe, Susan Robin, Joan Leach, TLO 4 on Communication, and Wendy Lachlan on TLO 5. These names are very familiar to many of you, and we're very grateful for their participation. At this point, I'd like to invite Les and Liz to come up and say a word or two about their journey, what they did, and some of the background to some of the work that they chose as part of TLO 3. Right.
Well, Liz and I realised that our TLO was the most important, so so we made our good practice guide the biggest. The other thing is that between us we were aware of work that was happening around the country in science on inquiry and problem solving, and that helped greatly to allow us to contact people and get their input, because if there's a strength of the document, it is in the examples at the end. My experience is that practitioners who want to get to listen to practitioners, we could have used a more academic approach and abstracted information from the literature that was primarily scientific education, but that's not what people listen to and act on. So we definitely wanted to get the voice of the academics who are wrestling with difficult problems and seeing how they actually cope with them, because that's what I think your academics will take notice of. We also put in things like websites, and we try to frame it to begin with as why is it important. So although the TLOs were a big issue, of course, we wanted to say, well, why is it important? The Ian Chubbs of this world are talking about the importance of inquiry to the general education of anyone who does a science degree and goes on to it. So we try to get a little bit of why is it important, even though in a sense that was already decided because there was a TLO and it was the biggest TLO. But still, I think going back to that is important. And working with Liz was great. So.
Not that you're biased or anything, Liz. I just wanted to say something about the collection of the case studies. Inquiry and problem solving is at the heart of science, and if you ask, whenever I've asked any science academics about it, they say, yes, of course, it's terribly important to us. So the problem for us was not finding rare examples, but how would we represent the diversity of what was out there. And we've said in the Good Practice Guide, and I want to say it as publicly as I can, that it by no means is representative. What it is a snapshot of various aspects of inquiry and problem solving that we felt were well illustrated by those examples. But there is heaps of really good work out there done by people at very varying scales. It might be a small exercise that they slot into an existing subject, right up to the one that's given in there from the University of Queensland, which is a whole curriculum stream around inquiry. And so this begs the question of, these are the examples that we've put together for now, but then where do we go with that in the future? Where do people share good practice, share bright ideas? And this comes back to something that I brought up before, the idea of the practice exchange. And we certainly haven't sorted that out yet, but I think it's an issue that we need to think about in context with the good practice guides. Where from? How do we add to them? How do we grow them in the future?
I think because we've used exclusively exemplars from Australian context, that gives us a chance, gives people a chance to contact those people within Australia to actually, I think, to interrogate them a bit more, because it might just be that one page it just gives you the taste of what you did, but there might be something really important, like how did they evaluate? Do you want some more information about that? Well, we couldn't put great detail involved in a great job of Liz did to condense what in some cases was a fairly large tome that someone would send us down into one page. And that it really is a launching point for people to look at them and say, well, what bit of it would be applicable and adaptable to the local context.
The contributors were really passionate about it, and they were really willing to share. And I've got to say, although editing is always fun, people were terribly generous about it. And I'd say, look, we've only got one page. I can't describe your subject as a whole. And they were, okay, fine. Let's just get something up there which illustrates the diversity. So I think there's a lot of willingness out there to share good practice, and a lot of willingness to help somebody else who's struggling with the problem.
My last part shot would be, it really is a compilation of a lot of the work of other people. So although we might take some of the credit for it, it's really down to the people that have submitted the exemplars that really deserve the recognition. So, thanks.
Well, thank you, Liz and Les, and thank you to all our authors and all the contributors to these good practice guides. There has been a lot of hard work over the last 4 or 5 months or so to put these together, so thank you very much to them. I'll just hand over to Sue to continue.
So the final thing is to tell you where you can obtain these. We did, of course, hope to have the final products ready for you today, but all these projects take a little longer than you think initially. The state of the nation at the moment is that the guides are currently with a copy editor. They then have to go to OLT for final approval by OLT, but they will then be available, firstly on the OLT Resource Library, secondly on the ACDS Education Centre website, and expect to see them on other websites such as Les's own fellowship website. So we do want these to be disseminated as widely as possible. And this information is on the handout, so please make sure you take it home. So I'm saying soon, I would say within the next month. The other thing I'd like to say is that we will be having a second launch to a slightly different audience, to our broader suite of colleagues at the ACSME conference coming up in September. So just to finish off then, to link this project back to what Liz was talking about at the beginning. As we said at the beginning of our talk, these good practice guides are a start. They are an initial foray into producing a suite of resources that will help us think about good practice in science education. And we hope that in the future, over the next few years, we will see the literature review, we will see resources, and particularly we'll see examples of good practice being added to the guides, perhaps the guides as a whole being refined and re-edited, renewed through the website. So in a way, there is a challenge to all of you. We do have a lot of people to thank. Brian has already thanked the authors of the guides. They were an incredible team to work with. The degree of enthusiasm was wonderful. We had a really good meeting in Brisbane and some Skype meetings. But I'd also like actually to thank the colleagues who submitted expressions of interest that we weren't able to take up. The good practice examples, really, they're the heart of the guide, so those colleagues are really an important part of the project. The OLT provided funding, and it's a pity Siobhan's not here because her personal support's been really important to us through this project. She's a great champion of science education. And of course the ACDS, especially John, thank you for continuing to support this and so many other educational initiatives. Brian, would you come back up, please? Stand over that side. What we would really like to ask you to all raise your glasses. So here's a virtual bottle of champagne.